Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 25 of Rebreak Radio. I'm Dennis, and today I am joined by Mike,
Hello.
also known as ReadyEdgemont.
That is true. On Twitter.
Yeah, cool. So you just came back from GDC, Game Developers Conference,
Yep.
and we're gonna talk a little bit about that later. But first, we're just gonna quickly talk a little bit about what games we've played, and yeah, just if you want to take this as like the games that you played at GDC, like just um, whatever you found most interesting, or like whatever you played on your other time or whatever. So, what have you played?
Sure. So before I get to what I played at GDC, just generally what I played recently, I tend to focus more on PC gaming. So recently, I've been playing Crusader Kings 2, Elder Scrolls Legends, and then I recently just got Assassin's Creed Origins and have been sinking my teeth into that. And then a little time before that, I played for the first time South Park: The Stick of Truth and absolutely loved that. At GDC, I tended to gravitate more towards the Indie Games Festival nominees. So I played Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy, Night in the Woods, West of Loathing, which actually there was a Switch demo being passed around, but it's not available yet. It was more just a technical showpiece, which was fun. Baba Is You. I played a bit of Cuphead for the first time. Didn't really play a ton of it beforehand. I played Chuchel Celeste, which was there as well.
Mm.
Just trying to think of other things off the top of my head. Played a little Tacoma, um, and I think that's mostly it for IGF. And then outside of that, I did
Are there a
some.
lot of already like released games at GDC?
Yeah, there's a few. So the IGF, if you're not familiar, is the Indie Games Festival. A lot of those games that are nominated are games that were launched in 2017 and that were submitted.
Okay.
So most of those games are out and available. Um, but some of the other ones that aren't released are the more technical demos that are being used as proof of concept to just show stuff, and that's more from the big publishers or the big names out there. So, for example, Unreal Engine and Epic Games is always there showing off stuff. So obviously, they had some Fortnite demos going on just to show people who hadn't played Fortnite. And then in the Oculus booth, they were doing a bunch of demos just for proof of concept for VR and AR. So one of the cool things is I got to play Settlers of Catan, the VR experience at the Oculus booth with both the Oculus Rift and then the Oculus Go, which I don't think is currently at a production release state, so it was like a very early tech demo.
Mm.
But that was a lot of fun. And then, yeah, some other stuff I can't necessarily get into or talk about for legal reasons because I had to see it behind closed doors. But yeah, so a lot of cool stuff going on there.
Yeah, that's cool. Cool. What was your the favorite game that you played?
Um, I would have to say probably Baba Is You, or Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy. They're kind of hard to describe. I would recommend looking them up if you have the chance.
I'm familiar
And I
with
think they're
Getting Over It.
okay. Getting Over It, yeah, it's just a very odd mechanic, and it plays really well for kind of the show floor atmosphere of just
Mm.
people looking at that game and like just watching other people play it, and it's a lot of fun. I really enjoyed playing that. Baba Is You, obviously, just because of how innovative it is for game design, with like using words to change the way mechanics work in that game, and it's a very interesting concept and interesting game to play. And then the other one was probably Chuchel, which was nominated for excellence in visual art for the IGFs, and that game is just it's very novel. So yeah, all those games are very difficult to explain unless you actually play them. But I'd recommend for everybody listening to check that out if you have the chance.
Cool. Cool. Well, as for what I have played, um,
What? Yeah, what have you played?
yeah, I've gone back and played all the SteamWorld games again. Are you familiar with the SteamWorld games?
Not really.
Yeah, so it's It's like a Swedish indie series of games, and they're really awesome. It's more, I think the most famous game in the series is SteamWorld Dig 2, which came out last year. It was a meteoric hit on Switch. Um, so, and they've since ported SteamWorld Dig 1 and SteamWorld Heist to Switch again. So I've gotten them and I've played through them all. So SteamWorld Dig is it's basically imagine what would happen if you merged Metroid with Minecraft,
Okay.
basically. So you go into like a mine and you start digging down and you start collecting resources, and you basically dig your own path through the world, and then you go back up and you sell your gems and you buy upgrades to your character, um, so that you can dig longer and you can stay down there for a longer time. You have more health, and you also have like this lantern that goes out after a while, and you can upgrade it to keep going longer and all that stuff. It's a really fun game, and the story is uniquely like or like oddly interesting for being like such a simple indie game, so to speak, like that is not really focused on the story. Like you can completely ignore all of the like text boxes in the game and you'll still like understand why the story is cool. Um Basically it's like set in an alternate universe of Earth where like back in like the early, I don't know exactly when that was, but like when Steam technology started becoming um like was starting to being created and all that stuff. Like what if that became more like prevalent, and they started making more of that. So they started making like Steam bots, and eventually humans became um too lazy. So robots just took over the world because humans didn't have anything to do.
Yeah, so like steampunk.
Yeah. Um,
That's cool.
yeah. It's really cool. And later on, like you realize basically that humans aren't dead and all this stuff, and it's actually a really cool story. And what happens later on is like then they made SteamWorld Heist, which is a turn-based strategy game. It's like a completely different kind of game. If you're familiar with Fire Emblem, it's kind of a little bit like that.
Yeah.
Um, but it's not. It's more like it's still on a 2D plane, so like a side-scrolling plane, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's that's a really cool game, and then they made SteamWorld Dig 2. So
Yeah. I just found that on Steam, so I just added it to my wish list.
yeah, they're really awesome games. They're also on 3DS if you want to play them portably.
I might get them there. Or
I
save.
think they're
Wait to get
actually
that on the Switch.
all on sale right now on 3DS. So
Oh, okay, I'll look
yeah.
into it.
Then I've also played. I played a new game that I found on. Do you know about Game Maker's Toolkit? Mark Brown, a YouTuber.
Is it anywhere familiar to Game Maker like the platform, like GML?
No. It's like
Okay.
it's a YouTube channel about
Okay.
game design and stuff like that. And
Oh no, I'm not familiar.
he made a video about what is it that makes a good puzzle in a game, and in it he showed off a game called Snakebird. Have you heard about this?
I have not. This is digging past my general knowledge.
Yeah, it's a game. It's on Steam and mobile, I think, and I have it on mobile. It's just a puzzle game where you play as this like snake shaped bird, and you have to like collect all the fruit in the stage and then go through a portal. And yeah, it's it's a very hard puzzle game, and I'm enjoying it right now. So that
Nice.
was cool. Other than that, Oh yeah, I also played Shantae and the Pirate's Curse. Do you know what game that is?
I've heard of it, but I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, so yeah, Shantae is like a long running franchise. It's like a very interesting
Yeah.
franchise in terms of like how it's like it was originally published by Capcom, and it had one game on the Game Boy, and it came out in like 2001, like years after the Game Boy was relevant.
Yeah.
And then somehow Way Forward, who makes the game, somehow got the rights to it, and they made a new game on DSiWare, and then they made one on 3DS and one on current gen consoles. And Pirates Curse is the one that came out on 3DS and have then been ported to like everything at this point. And yeah, it's an amazing Metroidvania style game.
Nice.
Yeah, so I've been playing that too. But yeah, so let's get into the GDC part of the show. So, what is GDC?
So at its base level, GDC is what it means, just the Game Developers Conference. It's where game developers from around the world, well, realistically around the world, but in practicality, recently more difficult for that to be true, um, where game developers from around the world get together to talk about best practices, what they're working on to showcase games, to talk about the industry and how the industry is doing and what we could be doing to make the industry better. Um, and there's a lot of ways we go about doing that. One of the larger institutions at GDC is the International Game Developers Association, or the IGDA, and they have a lot of subset branches. I'm a member of the IGDA, as many of the people who go to GDC are, and there's a bunch of different groups you can get into, like the IGDA Indie Special Interest Group, or SIG. There's a game design SIG, a QA SIG, production SIG, an LGBTQ plus SIG. There's like all kinds of different representations about game developers, the games they're making, and that kind of stuff. But also, it's a great event for networking, meeting people that you might not know or see on a daily basis, and just being able to connect with them, talk to them about their games, and maybe collaborate or have them as a contact, and be able to bounce ideas off of in the future. And then since I've been going, this is like my fifth year. Some of the people that I met in my first year, seeing them as students like I was, it's always a good place to be able to reconnect with them and see where they are. So some of the people I met and worked with my first year, that were students in my freshman, sophomore, juniors in various universities, I can now call good friends that work in EA, Bungie, Psyonix, Riot Games, all over the industry. So it's a great place to reconnect with old friends as well.
Cool. Cool. So, what as someone like me who's like trying to get into the industry and someone who isn't necessarily in the games industry, is there any um is there a reason like why should I go to GDC for instance? Like could I
Yeah.
get anything out of it?
Well, yeah. So I guess I could address that pretty well because this is the first year that I've actually been able to go as a developer. And actually, on my name tag had NetherRealm Studios, which was a huge moment for me.
Mhm.
But for the last 4 years, I've been going as a student, and I was going as a networking opportunity, but also to know what the bar was for getting into the industry and kind of to see how people talked and get the language of the industry and like certain basic things down and kind of getting a feel for that. So there's a lot of value going as somebody who's not a developer who wants to be a developer. And anybody who makes indie games is at this point considered a developer, which wasn't always the case in the past. But yeah, you can get a lot out of it just from learning the way developers use certain tools or what tools they're using, or just the way they talk about games and learning how to make games, and a lot of things that you probably never would have thought of. Like, for example, this year I was at the roundtable for quality assurance, and there's a lot of cool things that I never thought about in terms of QA that I found super valuable that I was able to then bring back and work on doing QA at NetherRealm, because that's what I currently do for like automation and best practices and making sure like our bug reporting techniques were a little bit more concise. So there's always something you could learn. And again, probably the most valuable thing in my mind is just the networking and being able to talk to people and just to get to know people who are like you, because there's definitely going to be people like you that are not in the industry but want to get in. Specifically, there are parts of GDC that have the career pavilion where students come and listen to post-mortem talks from guys from Blizzard about game design or engineering or building your own tools and stuff like that. So there's definitely a skew for aspiring game developers there. So I would say it's very valuable for people who you know are hoping to get in and aren't sure yet, but want to learn more.
Yeah, like I would say my experience with GDC is all of the awesome GDC talks that they post on their YouTube channel.
Yeah,
Yeah, like I've listened to a lot of them, and like a lot of the times I don't understand anything of what they're
yeah,
talking about because it's a lot of like, and that is something that I like about it. Like it's really focused to game developers.
hmm,
Because like they bring up code on screen sometimes. It's like, yeah, I don't understand that, but like the people that who are programmers who are there to learn about the specific, like for example, like I watched one with their when they were talking about how they made the sand in Journey, and like the people who are there, like they're there so they can learn how to make good sand in a game. So when the dude shows up, like how they made the sand, like with like exactly how the shader is coded and all that stuff. Like, yeah, that is exactly what that person wants to know. And because like a lot of the times when it comes to like developer interviews, like in like the games media side and all that stuff, like it's just completely useless to a game developer because they don't really go deep enough for it to be um for them to be able to learn anything from it, if that makes sense. So I
yeah,
like the GDC like really goes deep and um, about like exactly how it works and all that stuff, sharing the
yeah, and kind of go
knowledge with the rest of the industry.
yeah, and kind of going off of what you were just saying there. One valuable tool from actually attending GDC is if there was something in that talk that you didn't understand after every single talk, the speakers always go to a breakout room to answer questions and talk afterwards. So if you didn't understand something specifically about that talk or about how that shader or like how it worked or what compiling methods they used, you could always go to them and talk and figure out like, oh, I didn't get this. Could you explain it more? And more than I would say more than 90% of the time, they're more than happy to have somebody ask them about their work because, it's a very selfish endeavor, wanting to talk about your work and what you work on. So, and that's, very useful. But kind of also going back to not understanding certain things. Like before the show, I was telling you that I'm not a traditionally trained like designer, programmer, whatever. I was a student of business who got into game design and then, game development.
Mm,
Um, like at GDC this year, there was a talk about acing your whiteboard interview, which is essentially if you're interviewing for an engineering position, being able to do pseudocode and work through a problem.
mm,
So I was watching a talk somebody give on that, and for their whiteboard interview, they were creating pseudocode in C++, and then somebody decided to take the extra step and actually put their code into like a pseudocode for assembly. And if you're not familiar with assembly, it's like a bitch to work with. So like I was going through that not with any traditional programming like background in my mind, but because I've worked with it and been to so many conventions or so many GDCs in the past, I had a general understanding of what they were saying, and then actually was able to correct the speaker on one thing in terms of like what she was doing wrong with the C++ by saying like, oh, you should have had it here instead of there, and eventually you get the hang of it. So kind of having more exposure over the years has definitely helped, and probably would help people if they go to GDC a lot, like I have.
yeah. Yeah, like assembly, that's basically like obviously computers like quote unquote talk in the ones and zeros, and we
Yeah,
program usually in code like C, C++, and whatever, all Java, all that stuff. And assembly is
yeah,
basically the step in between those, where it's like,
yeah. Real engine level stuff, like
yeah,
super, super deep. That if you, yeah, it's very difficult to wrap your head around sometimes.
yeah. So yeah, so what did you specifically do at GDC?
So like the majority of the time, if I can get on the show floor and play games, I tend to do that in my first day because it's a little bit lighter on the talks. And then afterwards, after I get the games in and the games I want to play before the IGFs actually happen, Then I tend to network more. I go to the roundtables for each of the special interest groups in the IGDA. So like the QA roundtable, the indie roundtable, um, the production roundtable, the legal roundtable, and I do a lot of networking and talk to people. And then intermittently between there, I'll go to specific tech talks about very specific things that I find interesting or want to learn more about. And in the past, a lot of that has been like revolving around creating your own studio or working as an indie or working in smaller teams. But as time has gone on, I've been kind of gearing more towards VR and AR experiences just because technically it's fascinating to me. And I've been fortunate enough to see the evolution of VR and gaming at GDC since 2014. So it's or 2013, 2014. Um, so I tend to gravitate more towards those because every year it gets more and more crazy. So that's primarily what I do. And then after hours GDC, there are always parties going on. So this year, just to name drop a bit, there was a party hosted by Zynga. One of my friends works there, so we always go there to that every year. Epic Games threw one, and Fortnite was obviously involved with that. And then there are a few smaller parties thrown by some indie developers that are friends of mine that I go to. So just kind of reconnecting and going to those events. So that's generally what I do most at GDC. And then collect business cards and talk to people and see what they want to do and try to put them in contact with people I know who might be able to use their talents.
Cool. Cool. Yeah. So I guess let's get into one of the coolest things that I saw out of GDC was like the new advancements to Unreal Engine that Epic showed off. Did you see this at all?
Yeah, so probably one of the very first days, they were doing a technical demo for being able to integrate rigging from Maya in real time within the Unreal editor, and actually being able to, uh, while in Maya, be able to change augments and change the skeletal meshing within for example, like a character, and see it in real time as it moved as a cinematic in the Unreal Editor, and that was really cool. And I don't tend to work a lot with rigging in games, but just to see that as an application where Unreal is again kind of ahead of the curve in terms of like what they can do,
Mm.
as opposed to Unity, which is usually always playing catch up, but is like an open source, and I tend to be for open source, software anytime I can be, but Unreal is just killing it. So that was really cool to see as a technical demo, and then also to see that they're progressing even more so with integration plugins for their blueprint system, which is primarily how I make games because again, I'm not classically trained in
Mm.
programming, but I'm a visual learner, so it was cool to get my hands on some of that stuff, and then also talking to the guys from Unreal and specifically Team Paragon, and talking to them about releasing everything or the majority of all their code and assets for free in the Unreal Store, and how I think that's going to be a benefit for people who are just coming up now as game developers to have all these AAA assets available to them. So yeah, there are a couple cool demos and a couple things behind the scenes that I can't necessarily talk about
Mm.
tech-wise, going through VR stuff that they're working on, but yeah, I did have a healthy amount of time working or talking to the guys from Epic about UE4 and its kind of future roadmap.
Yeah. Was it the Siren demo that you were talking about before, or was this something else?
Specifically for the rigging.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was I mean they showed a couple of different use cases, but I believe yeah it was the Siren demo, and it was kind of like a side kind of like a or not side scrolling fighting game, but more of a fighter, and being able to show the rigging that they use to pull in the skeletal mesh from Maya, and being able to manipulate it in real time in Maya and see its end result in Unreal. So that was really cool to see.
Yeah. One of the like I was specifically very impressed by Siren, which was basically like they showed off like a digital human being acted in real time by
Oh
an
yeah, no,
actress.
yeah, I was talking about something completely different about
Yeah.
like rigging it, but yeah, so they had yeah, motion capture and yeah, being able to show that in real time, and they did that tech demo. I think I saw it 3 or 4 different times because it was something that they were just really hammering home. And that's something that specifically is super interesting to me in my use case because at NetherRealm, some people probably don't know, we have our own motion capture studio. So we frequently bring in people and do our own motion capture for all of our games. So that was something in real time, being able to create that quick feedback loop of, you know, trying to get the minimal viable product of something and seeing how it works in real time so you have more ability to be agile and be like, okay, that's not exactly what we're looking for. Let's try this or let's try that and seeing, getting the best results that you can. But yeah, yeah, that one was really cool.
Yeah, and I watched like a talk that Unreal did like about how they made that 3D model, and wow, that was some really impressive stuff there. And they also showed off like Andy Serkis doing like a performance that they then put on a digital version of Andy Serkis, but they also put it on like an alien character. Um, and like I first saw that video on IGN, and I was looking, and it was like a side by side. You could see Andy Serkis on the left, and you could see like the alien on the right doing the same performance. And I was like, is that Andy Serkis real? Like I could not see
Yeah.
like, is that a digital Andy Serkis? And then later on, I was like, yeah, it's a digital Andy Serkis. But like, damn, it was like really impressive. I wonder like how powerful the computer is that is running that in real time, because that is sure ain't running on a like commercial level computer.
Yeah, I mean, it all has to do with like how they're encoding that information. And it actually might be, I think it probably is related technically to what I was seeing before. So I couldn't think off the top of my head, so I just went back through my notes from GDC. The proprietary tool plugin they were using between Maya and Unreal, it's called LiveLink. So
Mm.
the idea is it's an animation data through external sources, and it uses .mll source files to like encode in real time if you're editing something in Maya, being able to see it in real time in Unreal, and I think vice versa. So I think that might have had some hand in that, black magic, which somehow Epic Games is always figuring out a way to do. Um, but yeah, so yeah, I you'd be surprised the amount of power you can get out of some of the, you know, uh, top tier workstation graphics cards and CPUs. But yeah, it was crazy to see both of those demos happen.
Yeah, yeah. So let's see, was there anything else cool that was shown off at GDC?
Um, Let me think. I mean, I guess off the top of my head, Oculus always has a really cool booth, and I think I was telling you before in the pre-show that I had played Settlers of Catan VR, and one of the weird things for me was when I was doing that demo. I'm not sure if you're familiar with. Do you know who Jesse E. Schell is?
No.
Okay, so Jesse Schell wrote basically the game design Bible. Like he was the guy who really pioneered like early game design and being able to implement that on like being able to teach game design in an academic environment. And he is the CEO and founder of Schell Games in Pittsburgh. And he's also been like a very large proponent of VR and kind of like a pioneer of VR with some of the greats. And it was crazy because like I'm a big fan of his work and a big fan of what he does, and I actually know a few people that work for him in production at Shell Games. And when I was doing this technical demo, I had heard him, and he was like behind me to like calling things out of like what to do in the game. So it was like unreal for me to be sitting playing Settlers of Catan in VR with one of the pioneers of VR standing right behind me, like kind of sort of shit talking me. So it was kind of fun. I think that was probably the most interesting and crazy zany thing that happened at the show uh, for me. And then outside of the show, I got to meet Danny O'Dwyer for the first time, which was kind of cool.
Cool.
Um, yeah, so I'm sure you're familiar with Danny from Kind of Funny, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or when he was with Games Dale. Yeah, so I met him. he's like, "Can I interest you in a slightly soiled, sweaty sticker?" And I'm like, "Sure." So he gave me a sticker for no clip. Um, but yeah, so that's probably the most exciting things I did at GDC this year.
Cool. Yeah. So there was a lot of talk before GDC, or there's a lot of talk before every GDC is like, oh, what's gonna be announced? What's gonna be announced? And like obviously GDC is a developer focused show, so I always thought it was so weird that people were like speculating, oh, what are people gonna announce at a developer focused show? And like, is that a weird thing to think for like for me, or is like do 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 companies actually announce like commercial stuff at GDC?
Um, in my experience, very rarely will you ever see a major announcement come from GDC just because most of those announcements are either going to be saved for E3 when
Yeah.
that rolls around because we're not that far away from E3 and most people are going to keep the cap on that. Or you'll see what like Nintendo does and they'll do uh their kind of smaller, more easily digestible format things for like the Nintendo Directs. Um, and like I was telling you when we had talked, like via message on Discord earlier, like Nintendo didn't really have much of a presence, and they never really do have much of a presence at GDC, which is kind of a shame because I'd like to see more of them. They don't really have a booth
They had
at all.
two talks. They had a talk about the development of ARMS and one about the development of Splatoon and Splatoon 2.
Yeah, but so that's like so they'll have people come and give talks from Nintendo, but they're not necessarily representative of Nintendo. They're just an individual from Nintendo, and that's usually how the talks go. But Nintendo as a company doesn't have a presence in the same way Oculus does, or Unreal does, or Microsoft or Sony does, who have these giant show booths on the
Mm.
floor where you can come and talk to developers and actually get a feeling for the company itself. But going back to your question, yeah, we don't really have a lot of announcements there just because it's not the same nature and there's not that kind of fervor around getting an announcement. This is more for, I mean, this is really like inside baseball. It's like people in the industry wanting to talk about what we're doing and looking at each other's games and stuff. So there's not a lot of announcements,
Yeah.
generally speaking. But in years past, there have been some, but not many. So I would just say, as a consumer, I wouldn't look towards GDC as some sort of hope for any sort of announcement. And generally, within the industry, it's not the best place to announce it. It's more of a time to celebrate the games that have been out, like during the Game Developers Choice Awards and during the IGFs, rather than talk about games that will come out.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. I think though, in terms of like actually specifically on the ARMS and Splatoon talks, like I think they were actually the directors of the games we were talking.
Yeah,
And also like last year, they did a talk on Breath of the Wild, and that was the director of Breath of the Wild, and I believe Eiji Onuma was there as well. So and I think at least these talks have been like actual Nintendo developers. I'm not familiar if they've been doing any other talks as well, but
yeah, and I'm not saying that they're like not Nintendo developers. What I'm saying
mm,
is, they're not representative of Nintendo. They could be a developer from Nintendo, but they're not there in any official capacity
yeah,
to
yeah,
like
I understand.
hire or talk about the company and all that. And like kind of going to that, in 2015, I saw Ted Price, who is the founder and CEO of Insomniac Games, give a post-mortem on Sunset Overdrive,
Mm,
which was really cool. But like, Insomniac I think had a bit of a presence there. They definitely had a presence this year because they were doing some hiring and ramp ups for the new Spider-Man game
mm,
that will be coming out towards the end of this year. But like at that year, they had just worked on, or they were working on Song of the Deep, or were just finishing up post ops on Song of the Deep. So like they weren't there in any official capacity, but they had their CEO there, and he was just giving a talk, and you know like you were saying, the Nintendo guys there talking about ARMS and other stuff. They're kind of there to talk about what they had learned or what
mm,
they thought they could have done differently to teach other people because our industry is unique in the sense that we're very free form with giving information out, especially because you have so many people within the industry who move between multiple companies. So, kind of sharing that goodwill and being able to say, okay, this is where we messed up. This is what we learned, and this is what you guys should take back to your studio and like not make the same mistake we did.
mm.
So that's always super useful to have.
Yeah, that's very cool. Like, um, yeah, and I also think like it could be like why Nintendo doesn't have a big presence at GDCs, because like I think the Japanese culture is a lot more secretive,
Hmm.
and I think that is also where the game in like it might be like where the game industry got all of its secrecy from, possibly. Um,
Yeah, yeah, a lot of the it's kind of hard to pinpoint where all that secrecy came from, and I think a lot of it had to do with definitely from the Japanese model of like making games, but also I think a lot of Japanese developers have a hard time like confining to the format in GDC about talking about certain mechanics,
mm,
just because a lot of Japanese games tend to be so innovative and so like we were talking about beforehand how like novel some of the concepts out of Nintendo are that the games they make aren't necessarily like they don't have the intent of making a Mario game. They make a game with weird mechanics and then later implement it being a Mario game. And
mm,
since those mechanics are so new and so different, sometimes it's difficult to talk about those in any meaningful way because not everybody can quite wrap their head around a mechanic unless they played a game, and those games have to be out. So, like, there have been definitely interesting postmortems from Japanese developers, but talking about the mechanics that they're working on currently is sometimes a little bit difficult to do.
so yeah, since you're a game developer, how do you feel about the entire conversation about game developers unionizing?
So it's a definite conversation that needs to happen. Now, to what degree we unionize is a question. In general, my stance has always been that I am not for the unionizing just because it is so difficult to gauge the value proposition of individuals within a company because it's a creative endeavor and it's not the same as, at least in the United States, the unions traditionally would be like the railroad union or a plumbing union or something like that, where the quality of work there's like some standard to it. But because we're still such a new industry, it's kind of hard to gauge that. And that's also coming from somebody who is currently a contractor at my company, where I'm not afforded the same rights as everyone else. Like I don't have health insurance paid through for my company, and if we were to unionize, it would probably end up costing me my job and costing a lot of people their jobs. So the one way I look at it is um, the concept of a minimum wage and unemployment. So you cannot have a minimum wage and at the same time want everybody to be employed. So if you want everybody to be employed, you cannot have a minimum wage. But if you don't care about people being employed, having a minimum wage makes the quality of life better for people that are employed. So if you want to have more people that are in game development, having a union isn't intuitively good for that in the sense that like you're not going to be able to have as many indie games because people are going to have to be paying union benefits, and a lot of indie game devs and companies and studios wouldn't be able to pay that. Now, of course, the EAs and the Activisions of the world, because of the money that they make, they could afford to, but it would definitely cut out the bottom tier of game developers and might, in my opinion, get rid of the indie environment entirely.
Mm,
Especially if people could be like, well, I could work for your indie studio, but you're not up to union standards, so I'd much rather work for this company. And at the same time, California is very strict in defending game developers. So companies that are not incorporated in California have some benefits for contract workers. So, like for example, because I technically work for Warner Brothers, um, they're not allowed to hire a contractor consecutively more than 12 months of a year. So my contract ends after 9 months, and then I will have 3 to 4 months of potential unemployment where I'm going to have to be waiting around for to be able to be hired again by Warner Brothers because they can't hire me again without having to pay me benefits because that's California law. Now, if they were incorporated in a different state, that might be different. But if there was this blanket overriding uh, statement saying everybody had to be unionized, that would be very difficult. And then on top of that, the extra difficulty is the fact that game development isn't necessarily centered in just one country. So unions worked for the United States because the uh, the people that were working within these unions were from the U.S., so the U.S. government had the ability to dictate these laws and rules. Game development, one thing brought up by Rami Ismail during his, hashtag one reason to be is game dev in different countries is exponentially different than it is in the United States, say. So, developers in Palestine or developers in Eastern European countries might not have the same resources that game developers in San Francisco and California have. So they might not be able to demand rights in the same way. So it would be kind of a trickle out effect. And if, say, there was a big push for unionization in the United States, if it was cheaper to develop games in Poland, say, for um, CD Projekt Red, you might see more outsourcing of jobs to more technically proficient people in developing countries than there would in the United States. So you might see a massive brain drain of development talent in these countries. So it's a difficult question to tackle. And props to the people that want to talk about like the Jason Schreiers of the world and the
Mm.
Greg Millers and all of them wanting to start this conversation. And I want to be involved in that conversation too. But I'm not as idealistic as some of them are. Like I don't think the industry is going to unionize anytime soon. And sorry for that rant. That's just kind of my take from everything that's happened this week and having talked to a bunch of different devs at GDC about it.
Yeah, no, I'm not like very um knowledgeable about like how work like contracts and all this fucking shit, how everything works, like the legalities of everything. So I can't really comment too much. I guess like all I have to say is like as long as developers are happy with their work environment and how they feel like they're getting paid enough for their work and all this stuff, as long as that is the case, then I'm happy.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's been evolving recently, not necessarily from any union standpoint, but just like as you know, the indie scene has exploded over the last decade, and that's because of so many people that have been disgruntled. And when you see so many people leaving studios, then the onus is kind of on bigger developers to be like, okay, how can we make it better? And one great way to look at it is like where I work, there is no mandated overtime or crunch. Like it's not required at all
Mm.
of it is optional. And so like I was telling you before the show, I've been working overtime for the last week since I got back. Um, and that's not because I have to. I do it because I care about my team members and I want to make sure that like I'm shouldering the burden to make their lives easier and make sure that like, people don't have to stay extra time or, feel like they have to stay extra time. Like I want to help my team and be a contributing member. So I choose to be there. But, like uh, in the past when crunch has been going on, there have been times when I'm like, hey, you know what? I'm a little burned out, so I'm going to take a break these 2 days and kind of rest up and then come back and be 100%. And then other times, I just wanted to keep working, and my boss told me, he's like, hey, you need to go home. We're not going to let you stay anymore. You've been here the last 8 days, so, fuck off. Like, you need to get some sleep. You need to have a life outside of work. So, like, I think the industry is getting better in that sense. But I don't, and I think there's like an upward trajectory of that being a thing that's more permeating to other studios, and I don't think we necessarily need unions to solve that. But yeah, I agree. As long as developers are getting paid, uh, you know, for their work in a way that they think is mutually agreeable and they're happy with their work-life balance, then I mean that's the ultimate goal. You want everybody to who makes games to be happy with what they're working on and how they're working on it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And like, I like specifically on like you were mentioning Jason Schreier and Greg Miller before, and I assume you were more specifically referring to that episode of Kind of Funny Games Daily where
Yeah,
they were talking about unions and all that stuff. And I saw a lot of in the chat because I was watching it live, a lot of people saying that they don't want um, game developers to unionize because that will make games more expensive. And to me, like I don't care if they unionize or not. Like as I said, all I care about is that they feel like they're being treated appropriately and being paid appropriately for the work that they do. And to me, if that means that games become more expensive, sure, I don't care because what I care about is that the developers behind the games that I love are treated the way they are supposed to be. And um, yeah, like I don't want to get a game and then like no, like oh yeah, people fucking slaved to make this game and people were like not paid enough to make this game. And I'm sure that is the case with a lot of the games that I love, but like I want the developers to um, have a good work environment, be treated appropriately, and all this stuff. And if that um, makes games more expensive, then sure, then that's how it has to be.
Yeah, and I understand the concern people have for not wanting to pay more for games, but ironically, as of now, games have stagnated in their price and have been $60 for better part of a decade in the United States, and I
Mm,
can't speak for elsewhere, but they're going to be going up, and you see that with there's $60 for the game, and then the season pass is like anywhere between $20 to $40. So realistically, if you wanted to get a game day one, it's going to be $100.
yeah.
And like that's kind of a large value statement to tell someone, shell out $100 for a game you're not quite sure of yet.
And then
And
there's microtransactions, loot boxes, and all this stuff.
yeah, and that's tough. But ironically, despite that, this is probably the most cost-effective time to be a gamer in the history of gaming, just
Yeah.
because you have resources like Humble Bundle, you have resources like the Xbox games for gold, or the deals that they have with gold, or the PlayStation Network, being really good, and Nintendo with the Nindies, and Steam, obviously, being a huge proponent of selling games at a discount. So, and I was telling you beforehand, I just recently got Assassin's Creed Origins because it finally met my threshold of I could afford it because I wasn't
Mm,
going to pay $100 for the game itself and all the DLC. And I
mm,
waited until there was a sale, and I got it for under $50 and got the game and the season pass for under 50, which MSRP is about $100 at this point, but it'll definitely change.
mm.
Um, just because we have the ability to wait and do that. And for people that can't wait, it's unfortunate, but uh, I think it's still a very affordable time to game. And if the industry, and I don't think it's realistic that the industry unionizes, and if it did, I don't think that's going to affect the pricing of games. It's just going to affect the developers more so than the cost to consumer because
Mm.
there's obviously a marketplace and there is assumed rules where as of now to get a game, its base game, it's going to be $60. That might change soon, but to be competitive, the Activisions, Ubisofts, Microsofts of the world know that's where they need to sit in line, and so they'll have to fit everything according to that price point. So it's probably going to affect developers more than it would affect uh, consumers, but the developers it does affect those who stay employed will have a better quality of life. Those who aren't employed, it's gonna suck. So we'll see where it goes, but I'm actually very happy these conversations are happening. So
Yeah. So there's obviously been a lot of talk like during the loot box controversy that happened and all this stuff. Like some people saying that instead of season passes and microtransactions and loot boxes and all this stuff, we should raise game prices to 70 instead of $60. And um, do you think that would actually solve that issue? Because to me, I feel like if if the gaming industry and the and everyone becomes like, oh yeah, games are $70 now. I feel like a lot of the quote unquote evil publishers will be like, oh yeah, we can raise game prices to $70 and keep the microtransactions. I feel like that's actually what would happen.
um, so there's a lot to unpack there, but what I will say is in terms of like the quote unquote evil publishers, it's them trying to meet a bottom line. And,
Mm,
as much as people hate EA for so many reasons, they employ so many game developers and make so many dreams come true in terms of
yeah,
like bringing novel ideas and bringing entertainment to people. And I always found it comical that, like, in the past years, they were voted the worst company in the US
that
two
is
years in a
crazy.
row
That is crazy.
when,
Like,
at the time in the political environment, like The BP oil spill had just happened and wreaked havoc in the Gulf of Mexico. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, you're gonna
Mm,
vote them? You're gonna vote them the worst company just because you felt that their game was a little bit rushed or like it was lacking in some feature. So it's kind of comical to see that, and it just shows how spoiled we are as consumers and as an industry that we expect so much from people.
mm,
Uh, but what I will say is like in terms of loot boxes, my personal opinion on them is as long as the two instances where they're acceptable is if it is a free to play game
yes.
and that works as a progression system, but it's not locking content. I mean, it could lock content, but like, if you didn't pay anything for the game, that's
Mm,
the way it's monetized. That's fine. If it's a $60 game, the loot boxes should be for purely aesthetic reasons. I think Overwatch does a great job of doing that. Now, it gets really dicey when you get a $60 game where there are loot boxes that affect progression in the way that we saw with Battlefront.
mm,
Now, that is where it becomes very untasteful because the expectation is if you pay $60, you are getting everything included in the game. Now, if there was a free, so I kind of like the way recently Rainbow Six Siege did it. They said, okay, there's the $40 version of the game that has everything unlocked and you can play with all the operators. Or there is the $15 version of the game where you do not have all the operators, but you're paying less, and then you will have to progress and eventually, buy currency to unlock operators. So like there are novel ways developers like Ubisoft are addressing it, and like it's good to see that innovation happening. But at the same time, I think this entire loot box discussion is also indicative of a young, growing industry
mm,
that doesn't quite understand what it is yet, in the same way that movies do, in the same way the music industry does, and we're gonna trip up. And it's kind of funny to be watching this entire loot box fiasco occur as I work at NetherRealm, considering that NetherRealm was once, or what NetherRealm is now. So it used to be Midway Games. This game studio was at the center of the political fervor and debate for the ESRB
mm,
because at the time, Mortal Kombat was considered so overtly violent that it was affecting children and how they perceived violence in video games.
mm,
And that's still a topic we talk about today, and that caused the birth of the ESRB. So it's funny to see that, a bunch of gaming organizations, ESRB, IGDA, everybody trying to address loot boxes and creating all these new measures in the same way that people were scrambling to create the ESRB back then. And I think it's going to self-correct in time, and I think the writing's on the wall for companies like EA knowing they can't do stuff like that again. And if they do, it needs to be some sort of meaningful loot box. And I think Destiny kind of sort of did a good job with that, or at least Destiny 2, with the Bright Ingrams and all that stuff, and it being purely aesthetic. But yeah, when it comes to loot boxes, that's kind of the only palpable way consumers can really see it. Anything other than that, I think, is just not gonna fly anymore.
mm. Yeah, like you mentioned earlier there, like if your game is free, I don't give a shit about how you earn the money. Like if you have a bunch of microtransactions and loot boxes and all this stuff, like the game is fucking free. Like you
Yep.
need to get your money somehow. Just make sure
Hmm.
it's like respectful towards the player and all of this stuff. Like you don't want to be constantly like bombarded with ways to buy things. Like you want to at least make sure the gamer is having a good time, but still try to be able to get your money somehow. So like as long as the game is free, obviously like be creative with your monetize plans. But yeah, like as you were saying, with when if the game is actually like if it's a paid game, then you need to think a little bit more about how you do things. And something I specifically was thinking about, and I was wondering how you feel about this. So in terms of if you look at a game like World of Warcraft, I don't know if it has it anymore, but it at least used to have a subscription fee.
It still does, yeah.
Yeah. And if you look at Overwatch's basically subscription fee is the loot boxes, right?
Yeah.
That's basically how they took like what used to be a subscription fee and made it something more like optional. Um, And I think at least like when it comes to a game like Overwatch that is supposed to be the only entry in basically the only entry in the franchise and it's gonna be live for a long time, then I think you really need to think about like how do we fund this game for a long period of time. But like in terms of Battlefront 2, a game that is already a sequel to another game and will probably be replaced in 2 years by Battlefront 3, do we really need a long-term solution for funding this game?
Yeah, not necessarily. And I don't think. I mean, they might make another one, but based off the reactions they had, they would be better off creating something similar to like Overwatch in the sense that it has longevity. And I think that's the only way they're going to be able to convince consumers to come back at this point because there's already so much bad blood with
Yeah.
everything that has gone on. And just from what I know and what I can talk about of that, like, Disney was not happy with EA
Mm,
after the way it was received. And I think that was widely publicized in the news about how EA was like, yeah, we can't have something like that. We're supposed to be a family friendly brand, and being seen in this light is not conducive to the kind of uh, brand imaging we're looking for. So already there's talks about how that's going to affect next iterations of games, and especially with the canning of the single player game that was going to come out. That's caused a lot of bad blood. So
mm,
yeah, in terms of like games as a service, I think the reason Overwatch, and this is kind of cleverly done, but the only reason Overwatch has been so successful is because Blizzard has the know-how of doing games as a service because they have done it longer than anyone else
mm,
because of World of Warcraft. Because they've been doing that since like 2002, 2003, I think, and it's still World of Warcraft is a subscription-based model. I think there are still concurrently close to 8 million players. It's not many, but it's in terms of like the scope of other games, like GTA 5 has sold over like 100 million copies or whatever that stupid number is
mm,
at this point, like the highest selling game in the U.S. alone, probably globally. But they don't need a huge install base; they just need a dedicated uh, core. And I think it's smart the way they're monetizing Overwatch now, especially with the Overwatch competitive league, because now they actually have owners of leagues. They have players that are playing. They have people that want to watch, and it's getting more and more competitive. So that's one way they could subsidize this league by working with them, because there's always money to have in some sort of sport league with it. So, yeah, I think Overwatch is probably one of the better pioneers in our industry about how you can make a good games as a service, and that's the model to follow.
mm. Yeah, and you were saying like yeah, we'll probably not see Star Wars Battlefront 3, and I meant it more in like we're looking at EA's plan. Like EA is obviously like if EA had their way, they're obviously making a third one. Um,
Yeah,
so but yeah, like
well,
it'll
EA is known for like doing their annualized franchises. Like they're
mm,
known for doing a Madden game every year, an NHL game every year, a FIFA game every year. So it's just kind of this very iterative process where they build upon systems they already have, and some people could argue that that's cheap or that's a cash grab. I'd argue that it's just them being able to innovate like constantly and hone their craft, and that's why they're so
mm,
good at what they do and why they own sports because they're so good at making those games that people like playing. And if that wasn't the case, there would be a competitor, but there's not. So,
mm. So how do you feel as you are a producer, right? Yeah, what do you think is the most effective way to like structure a game studio? Like if you had the opportunity right now to take basically all of NetherRealm and like, hey, I'm gonna structure this the way I want to because the way I feel is the most effective way to do it. Like, how would you do it? Like in terms of um company um like structure in terms of like the ladder basically of employment, if that makes sense, and also like how people spend their time and like the scheduling of people's time and all of that stuff. Like how would you structure that in a like a
yeah.
in a AAA studio?
Yeah, so in terms of time management, I think the way NetherRealm does it now is very good in the sense that so my work day is generally from 10 a.m. till 6 p.m., which I'm more than happy with. That allows me extra time in the morning. And also, I mean, there are a lot of older people in the studio who have kids, so being able to go into work a little bit later than everyone else allows them the ability to drop their kids off at school and like do stuff like that,
Mm.
which is good. But in terms of if I was to be a producer there and structure it, I think one of the most important things that has to go into place just in any studio is that uh, best idea wins out. So the idea that in a lot of companies you'll see that there is this vision for a game and it's already designed and everybody needs to slave away at making this game the way it was intended to be made, as opposed to an organic thing. Like, so for example, I had friends that worked at Volition when Saints Row was first coming about, and the way that they made the game was they're like, okay, well, we want to have this in the game. We want to have, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Saints Row franchise, but it's like
Um,
GTA, except, yeah. So there were conversations of like, should we have a giant dildo bat in this game? And people were like, no. Other people were like, yes. They had a conversation about it, and ultimately, in the end, it wasn't the producer's call. It was everyone else saying, okay, this is the flavor of the game, and we want to add our 2 cents into this game and add our like opinion on this game, because if people feel invested in the games that they're working on, they're going to have a better quality of work. The
mm,
producer's job is just to make sure that all the roadblocks are removed, to make sure that everybody is able to do their best work, and making sure everybody is able to create a game in an orderly fashion. So basically, herding a bunch of cats. That's the job of a producer, to make sure the creative guys are able to do what they need to do within the timetable allocated. So there are really good talks at GDC talking about uh, managing this. So the idea of, let's say our timetable is, we only have enough money to fund this project for a year as an indie studio, or as, a bigger company like a Warner Brothers funded studio. We have a year to do this. And that's our budget. So what can we fit into this year, and then what could we push off as a feature update later to work on? And being able to pick what's important, and then from those important things, sourcing it to the team and saying, okay, if we do work on this, what are we looking for? So being able to crowdsource and pick the best ideas, not just the ideas of the people that are at the top. And then in terms of a company structure, I think it's very important to have leads for each of the disciplines. So
mm,
having an art lead, a design lead, an engineering lead, a QA lead, um, a production lead, people who could, at least in game development, you're going to have. So I work in agile development, so we'll have our scrums every once in a while, and I'm not always a part of the scrum because I'm not a lead, but my manager, he's the QA lead. He'll go to all those scrums and he'll disseminate the information passed around there, and that way it's easier to get information out a lot quicker to a lot of people. So he'll give us our task email saying, okay, this is our current change list, and these are all the issues we need to address. This is what the intended design is for this specific feature, and then we'll have it listed down in Confluence and talk about like all the things that are intended by design and stuff like that. So having the leads being able to talk and figure out, what's the best approach for making this feature work and whatnot, but then also being able to take that criticism from their teams and voice it at the scrums. That's super important. So obviously, like communication is key, and also within a studio, just being able to approach somebody and not being afraid to talk to someone just because of their position is hugely key. So like as a QA, or being in QA, if I ever have any question about any design feature, anything in engineering, anything in art, I can literally get up from my desk and walk over to the artist, or walk over to the engineer, or walk over to the designer and say like, hey, why are we doing this? And should we be doing this? And
mm,
then that will start a conversation that we could then loop production into and say, okay, like, and I can't talk about certain things I'm working on, but
mm.
like there
Yeah,
was
of
an
course.
instance of a feature that wasn't included in one of the titles we're working on, and I was like, hey, why isn't that in the game? And they're like, huh, that's a good question. So we went to the production team and we're like, hey, was there any intended functionality with this feature? And they're like, not really. And I'm like, okay, well, I think it would be beneficial to the end user. So they're like, okay, that sounds good. We'll put that in the next update. We'll work on programming that. And because you came up with this idea, we want you to be, would you mind taking point on this and kind of helping design and helping art kind of figure out how we should go about doing this. And I'm like, sure. So they delegated responsibility in me for this feature. They made me have a sense of ownership in a way that I probably wouldn't have had if I was in a company that wouldn't allow me to do that.
Mm.
So in terms of game development, just making sure everybody feels making sure everybody feels invested in what they're working on. I think that's key. So and there's probably other nitty gritty that I can get into, but that seems to be the one thing that I think is most important for game dev, making sure uh, everybody feels included and actually has a voice in the project they're working on.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Like I think, like when it comes to obviously like someone who is kind of a designer or on a bigger project, it's more like a director position. They obviously have more of a say in the project than anyone else because they're the one like kind of with the main idea to begin with. They're the one with the vision of where everything is supposed to go. But I think it's very important in that position that you're not like um stubborn or you think that your idea is always the best idea. So you always need to like listen to everyone else and make sure that um is my vision of this game the perfect way to go, or should maybe like there could be someone in like programming or something who's coming up with an idea for something that is extremely out of his profession, but like maybe it's a good idea and you need to consider it.
Yeah. Then when you are in those instances of like your idea is the best, and sometimes you win those battles, sometimes you lose those battles, and the only thing that that does is just makes you better at being able to convince people of your ideas,
Mm,
and that's also critical. And I think that's the job of a producer. Like sometimes it's difficult to cut certain features because again, there are budgets, and we live in the real world, and if it was perfect, then we would be doing what Todd Howard's doing at Bethesda and taking about 8 years to make a another Elder Scrolls game because he has all the time in the world and all the money in the world. And sometimes deadlines are a good thing because that allows you to be intuitive in the same way that we talked about pre-show about, or I think it was pre-show, about why Nintendo makes such well-designed games. It's because they have limitations, and having those limitations, I would argue, make games better. So production has a vital role to make sure projects work because there have been too many projects on too many games where there was an unlimited budget or an unlimited timetable and it just ended up failing.
mm.
So it's important to know when enough is enough, and I think that's where production comes in. So, shameless plug, but shout out to my producers. They know who they are for doing the work they do because it's literally like herding a bunch of cats sometimes because you know artistic people just like having their way and like doing their thing, and
Mm.
sometimes it's hard to come to terms with letting their passion or their baby go, but sometimes it has to. But I think we do a pretty good job of balancing uh, those two extremes sometimes.
Yeah. So anything else you want to say before we finish off this episode?
I think that's it on my end. Just a thanks to you for having me on the show.
Yeah, no problem. It's always fun to talk to a bunch of different people. Like you, like yeah, you're more like focused on PC gaming, and you're also a game developer, and also always very interesting to talk to new people and new perspectives and all this stuff. But yeah, that is it for Rebreak Radio episode 25. Where can people find you at, Mike?
You guys can find me on my Twitter at ReadyEdgemont. You could also find me on my YouTube channel, which will be going through some changes soon, but that's just ReadyEdgemont as well on YouTube.
Yeah, links to that will be in the description as well. You can find me at Dennis underscore Lofgren on Twitter. You can follow the channel at Rebreak Radio on Twitter. Subscribe, like the video, comment below, all this stuff. You've heard it a million times. Also, go ahead and join the Rebreak Network Discord group. We have a lot of awesome people, and I wouldn't have found you and a lot of the other guests that I've had on the last, like, I think 6 episodes of the podcast. Wouldn't have found them without having made this group. So if you're looking for collaborators and all this stuff, you can find them there. And yeah, as I said, That's it for Rebreak Radio episode 25, and we'll see you again in the next episode. Bye.
Bye.